I'm not actually starting a new episode. This is more or less a discursion on a subject that I had brought up in another video. And it, it's been bothering me that I didn't give a better explanation at the time. Though I didn't have the time, that's why I didn't do it. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, that sort of throwaway comment really does deserve a full explanation. So I'm going to explain. In an episode of a Let's Play of Skyrim, I mentioned something about weapon choice and why anything other than an axe or battle axe was a complete and utter waste. And I believe I mentioned something about it, the reason being because of the perks. I think that deserves some explanation. However, to explain is going to require me to get pretty damn technical at times. And some of you may not understand. If you don't, well, hopefully you do. I will try to make this as absolutely blunt and simple and basic as I possibly can. But especially for the Mace and Warhammer perks, there's only so basic I can get, because a lot of what makes them so useless has to do with mathematics. And if you're not willing to spend some time doing the math, you won't understand. You just won't. But I'll still at least try. Okay, we're going to start off with the perks for one-handed and two-handed and great sword and sword. Doesn't matter what the name of the perk is, there's up to a maximum of 3 in that particular area for one-handed and 3 for two-handed. The first perk gives you an extra 10% chance of doing a critical hit. The second one gives you a 20% chance of doing a critical hit. The third one gives you a 30%, yawning, chance of doing a critical hit. But there actually is a reason why you shouldn't even invest one perk in any of them, let alone all 3. And I'll do my very dead level best to explain my reasoning. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that someone out there insists on using iron weapons. Now, armor, maybe shields, okay, maybe they'll accept that. But when it comes to actual weapons, it's iron and iron alone. And I'm going to even go further out on a limb and say somebody out there has so totally pimped out and maxed out smithing that they've got an iron sword that does, for the sake of argument, let's say 200 damage. Now, you're thinking to yourself, awesome! Because at the beginning, it's real. At the beginning of the game, when you're like level 5 and under, if you do get a critical hit, it is really, really easy by seeing the damage drop. That it's pretty simple to figure out that a critical hit does an extra 50% damage. It's just not hard to figure that out by the extra jump in damage that you saw when a critical hit happened. And you're thinking to yourself, awesome! I got this bitchin' iron sword that does 200 damage, and if I crit somebody, that's an extra 100 damage. Doesn't work like that. Crit damage is based off of the base damage of the weapon. And what is the base damage of an iron sword? Perks don't count. You can have all 5 perks in Armsman, and they don't matter a hill of beans. It has to do with the absolute base damage of the weapon. And the base damage of an iron sword is 8. So if you crit hit someone with that 200 damage iron sword, you're doing an extra 4. So you put 3 perks to get in there to get a 30% chance to do 4 extra damage. Okay, but what about great swords? You're thinking to yourself, well, they do more damage. Base damage still applies, so you're doing a little bit more crit damage with each crit hit. Big whoop. So instead of doing 8, I think the iron base is 16, so now instead of doing 4 damage, you're doing 8 with an iron great sword that could be doing 400 or more damage. So you're doing 8. Is that really worth 3 perks or even 1 perk? Seriously, is it? Not to me. Now let's get into the maces and the warhammers. This is going to be really, really technical. I'm not exactly sure how well I'm going to be able to explain this. Because like I said, this has a lot to do with basic math. This is an impossible scenario, but I'm bringing it up for illustrative purposes so that you can do, anybody who chooses to, can do the math. You have 1 piece of armor and 1 piece of armor only. Doesn't matter whether it's chest, hands, feet, or head. Still, you're wearing 1, and that piece of armor gives you an armor rating of 1. Like I said, impossible. There is no armor in the game that has only 1, an armor rating of 1. But, work with me here, people. We're going with theory here, for mathematical purposes. That 1 piece of armor that gives you an armor rating of 1 means that you are ignoring 0.12% of damage from any source except magical. I don't know. Armor does not ignore magic at all. Not even, it ignores 0% of magic damage. You have to have enchantments or equipment that have magic resist for that to go into effect. So you can have armor rating of the max cap at 567, and somebody can throw an ice spike at you, and it will be hitting you for full damage because you don't have anything that ignores ice damage or magic resist damage. This is strictly physical damage that I'm talking about. But that 1 armor rating allows you to ignore 0.12% of physical damage from melee weapons or ranged weapons such as bows, crossbows, whatnot. Now, let's move on to, say, you're wearing a full set of fur armor. Unimproved, but still fur armor. If I'm remembering correctly, I believe that the armor rating in full fur armor is like, except if you leave off the hat, is like 23, I think? 22, 23, something like that. But Since it's easier to do it with math, in an even number than an odd, let's go with the 22. Even if it is 23, we're going to say it's 22 for demonstrative purposes. Now, with that fur armor, and you're using, again, an iron mace, which I believe does 10 base damage. So, when you whack them with that iron mace, they are ignoring 2.54% of damage due to armor rating. You'll have to do the math, but trust me on this. It is 2.54%. So, what is 2.54% of 10? Well, it is 0.254 health. So you're not even ignoring, you're ignoring basically 1/4 of a health point. That armor is. In other words, it ignores no armor, because if it isn't at least half, it doesn't round up to 1. At least half of a point. And even then, I'm not sure that it actually does. I've never actually gone out of my way to test that, whether or not it does round up. But let's, for the sake of argument, say it does. It isn't even close to anywhere near being able to round up to 1 health. Now, let's say that you got that iron mace and it ignores, you got the first perk and it ignores 25% of armor. Well, what's 25% of 22? What? 5.5. See, now you ignore 5.5 armor, which drops it down to, what? 16.5. So now they have an effective armor rating of 16.5 against your weapon. Well, do the math. You still aren't even at 0.5%. Even half of a health point. Let's further move on to, let's say you have 75%. Well, that would be, let me see, 5.5, 5.5, 5.5. That is 16.5, which means it has, well, 5.5 health. It has an armor rating of 5.5. Still isn't even half of a hit point. And when it ignores armor, it does not ignore armor in the actual amount that the mace or warhammer does. You can have a really pimped out warhammer that does like 600 plus damage, but it's only going to ignore armor in relation to its base damage. That's right, just like the swords and greatswords, the perks are related to base damage. And unless the person is wearing, and this is with two-handed weapons. This illustration is specifically for two-handed weapons. I will give an illustration for one-handed weapons after I do the two. For a two-handed warhammer to do enough damage with all three perks, all three, to ignore even one, enough armor rating to do even an extra 1 point of damage the person would have to be wearing steel plate or stronger armor. Anything at all below steel plate, you're not doing enough, you're not ignoring enough damage, enough armor to do even 1 point of extra damage due to armor rating reduction. And with one-handed, they have to be wearing Daedric or Dragonbone armor. Anything below that, you're not going to do enough. There's not enough armor there for you to ignore to do even 1 point of damage. Now, I'm sorry, but are 3 perks really worth it to do even a point of damage against somebody that is unlikely you're ever going to come across? I mean, how many enemies do you go up against that if you have a Warhammer have a full set of steel plate or above? Yeah, they happen. Don't get me wrong, I know they happen. They might even happen just often enough to warrant the 3 perks. Maybe, if you're really lucky with random enemy generation armors. But for the one-handed, the odds of you coming up, there are no enemies that aren't scripted enemies that would even have Daedric armor. As a matter of fact, I can't think of a single enemy in the game without mods that has anything above ebony. I've never seen anybody with anything but ebony armor. Where? Now, I've gotten ebony armor from chests and whatnot, but I've never seen anybody in the entire game wear a single piece of Daedric armor. Except one person once wore a Daedric shield. But they were wearing ebony armor otherwise. So, I don't get the point in putting any perks in hammers, in maces, or warhammers. But, hey, to each his own. You do the math, and if you come up with a different mathematical formula than I came up with, maybe it's worth it to you, not to me. Now let's move on to axes, war axes, and battle axes. These are actually useful perks. I can't remember what the name of the perk is for two-handed, but in one-handed it's hack and slash. And hack and slash and its two-handed equivalent are very useful perks. And practically nobody knows it. And there's a reason why nobody knows it. It's because it is so very, very vague. It just says war axes do extra bleeding damage. Well, extra bleeding damage is pretty darn unspecified. But let me bring out the specifics. With 0 perks in hack and slash, a war axe still does bleed damage. It's the only weapon in the vanilla game. War axes and battle axes are the only weapons in the vanilla game that do bleed damage. And they do it even if you have no perks in it at all. Let me give you the breakdown. With no perks, a battle axe or a war axe, irrelevant of the type, or the, it's the same for an iron war axe or a dragon bone battle axe. It doesn't matter. With no perks, that axe of whatever kind does 1 point of damage per second for 5 seconds. and it stacks up to a maximum of 4 times. So if you get, say, 4 clean hits in, which means unblocked and undodged attacks, you get 4 clean hits in within 5 seconds of the first clean hit. Then you could be doing 4 damage per second for 5 seconds, which is 20 extra damage. That's useful as hell. And you don't even have a perk in it yet. Now you put a perk in. Now you're doing 3 damage per second over 5 seconds. And again, it stacks. Put the second perk in. You're doing 5 damage per second for 5 seconds. And again, it stacks. Now you put the last perk in. You're doing 7 damage per second for 5 seconds. And again, it stacks. With all 3 perks, if you get the maximum stack, you would be doing 140 damage over 5 seconds. Extra in bleeding damage alone. 140. That is useful. And when it comes to critical hit damage, it applies to bows as well as swords or any other weapon. Critical hits is still base damage, no matter the weapon or the chance or anything else. Which is why that perk in one-handed and two-handed, it goes by different names, but allows you to bull rush forward and do a power attack that does double critical damage. That one is a wasted perk too. Because what's double critical damage? Oh, big whoop. A power attack does double damage, and then you got double critical damage, which with that iron sword would mean now instead of doing 4 extra damage, you'd be doing 8. So you'd be doing double damage with a crit hit of its base damage. And is that worth a perk? Some people maybe, not me. But it actually is worth it to get that critical chance in bows. But only one. And the only reason it's worth it to get that one is so that you can now access the perks that are above it. That's it. That's the only reason to even put one perk in the critical chance for bows. So hopefully this explained in a way that people can understand why I'm so down on swords and maces in vanilla Skyrim. And why I just won't use them. I don't care what their speed is. I don't care what their perks are. Their perks are crap. I'll stick with my axe. Because at least an axe in game mechanics is useful. Because bleed damage also ignores all armor. You get a hit in, you're going to do full bleed damage. You can be up against somebody in legendary Dragonbone armor, and you get a clean hit in, you're going to still do max bleed damage. Bleed damage ignores armor. All armor. This is why I use axes. So, anywho, I hope this was an instructive video. I know it looks like I am actually in Skyrim Unbound's version of character creation, but I have it on this for a reason. I'm not actually creating a new character. As soon as I stop this video, I'm going to be erasing whatever was done here. There's not going to be a save file. I did this so that you didn't have to stare at the opening credits, the screen, and listen to the opening music over and over and over again. Besides, that music might be copyrighted, and I don't want to have this video monetized for music reasons. So anyways, I hope this was an instructive video, and I hope you learned something from it. And I hope I explained it well enough that you could learn something from it. Peace out. Gotta go. Bye.